Prime Minister Abbott, PM Lee, Deputy Prime Minister, Prof. Wang, Excellencies, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon and a warm welcome to the 35th Singapore Lecture. The Institute of Southeast Asian Studies is privileged to host this lecture, which will be delivered by the Honourable Tony Abbott, Prime Minister of Australia. And to begin the proceedings, it is my pleasure to invite Deputy Prime Minister Mr. Teo Chee Hean to give his opening remarks, introduce our distinguished speaker, and chair the proceedings. DPM, sir.
The Honourable Tony Abbott, Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister of Singapore, distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome all of you to the 35th Singapore Lecture. We are very privileged to have the Honourable Tony Abbott, Prime Minister of Australia, with us this afternoon. I thank Prime Minister Abbott for agreeing to deliver this lecture on the occasion of your official visit to Singapore, despite your extremely busy schedule here. Prime Minister Abbott's visit to Singapore takes place at a special moment for Singapore as we celebrate our 50th anniversary of independence this year. It is also the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Singapore and Australia. Australia was, in fact, the first country to do so. Indeed, Australia had played a prominent and helpful role in Singapore's history, one that predates Singapore's independence. Over the years, Singapore and Australia have built up a warm and deep relationship that spans many and diverse areas. We have a mutually beneficial and thriving economic relationship anchored by the 2003 Singapore-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Singapore is Australia's 5th largest foreign investor. Both countries enjoy excellent defence cooperation, with Australia generously allowing the Singapore Armed Forces to train in Australia. At the people-to-people level, we feel very comfortable with each other. Over 20,000 Australians live and work in Singapore, and some 50,000 Singaporeans study, work, or accompany their families in Australia. We had a warm reunion with many of these Singaporeans during Singapore Day in Sydney in October 2013. This close relationship is underpinned by a shared strategic perspective of our regional environment. Both countries cooperate closely in regional and international fora. Australia has played an important role in promoting regional stability and prosperity, particularly through its engagement of ASEAN and its participation in the East Asia Summit. We have worked closely together on numerous fundamental areas of commonality, such as preserving an open and inclusive regional architecture and promoting trade liberalization globally and regionally. While our relationship is already deep and dynamic, both Prime Minister Abbott and Prime Minister Lee have recognized that there remains more that both countries can do together. This is the genesis of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement signed by both Prime Ministers earlier today. The Comprehensive Strategic Partnership puts the flourishing friendship between Singapore and Australia on an even stronger footing over the next decade and beyond. Prime Minister Abbott is a well-known figure in Singapore. He started out as a journalist with the Australian and the Bulletin. He entered politics in the early 1990s, serving as press secretary and senior advisor to then leader of the opposition, John Hewson. Mr. Abbott has had extensive cabinet experience, having served in Prime Minister John Howard's government in various capacities, including as Minister for Employment Services, Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, and Minister for Health and Aging. Mr. Abbott was the leader of opposition from 2009 until he led the Liberal National Coalition to victory in the federal elections in 2013. Since taking office, Prime Minister Abbott has demonstrated an acute appreciation of the challenges that Australia faces as it comes off the mining boom and has kept the economy on an even keel, even as Australia embarks on economic restructuring. He has pushed ahead to enhance and consolidate Australia's engagement of the region and concluded free trade agreements with Japan, the Republic of Korea, and China. The comprehensive strategic partnership between Singapore and Australia provides yet another platform for Australia to expand its economic interactions with Southeast Asia and the larger region. Singapore has always been a strong proponent of Australia's active and continued engagement in the region. We believe that Australia has made and will continue to make a valuable contribution to the region's stability and prosperity. Indeed, under the leadership of Prime Minister Abbott, Australia has taken a clear and focused approach to engaging the region by emphasizing a closer relationship with countries in ASEAN and the Asia-Pacific region. Today, Prime Minister Abbott will speak on the topic of our common challenges, strengthening security in the region. Prime Minister Abbott has also shown leadership on the issue of jihadist terrorism, in particular, the threat posed by returning foreign fighters and self-radicalized individuals seduced by the violent ideology of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Earlier this month, Australia hosted a summit in Sydney on countering violent extremism, which made a valuable contribution to regional understanding and cooperation on this important issue. Terrorism and violent extremism are global challenges faced by many countries and need to be addressed with an adroit mix of domestic policies as well as regional and international cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, let me now invite Prime Minister Abbott to deliver the 35th Singapore Lecture. Prime Minister.
Prime Minister Lee, Deputy Prime Minister Teo. Today, it is an honour to follow three serving Australian Prime Ministers in delivering this Singapore lecture. Yesterday, it was my honour to visit the Kranji War Cemetery, where so many of Singapore's wartime defenders lie. As the Japanese swept down the peninsula in those years, Australian troops achieved the few modest Allied wins of that campaign: the stand at Bakri, the ambushes at Gemas and Jamalawang, and the fighting withdrawal from Muar, where the Australians went into battle singing Waltzing Matilda. Almost 1,800 Australians gave their lives in the fight for Malaya and Singapore, and over 1,300 were wounded. When Singapore fell, some 15,000 Australians became prisoners of war and 7,000 perished in captivity. Australians were about 10% of the defenders, but suffered some 70% of the battle casualties. It was the most disastrous campaign in British military history, but it helped to put beyond doubt Australia's commitment to the region. Just 73 years ago, Singapore was a burning ruin. Today, it's a wonder of the modern world. Just 50 years ago, when Lee Kuan Yew declared Singapore's independence, his country was poor, friendless, and facing an uncertain future. Today, it is rich, well-connected, and secure. Australians of my parents' generation were haunted by Singapore's fall. Australians of my generation and younger should be galvanised by its rise. Within 2 generations, Singapore has moved from the third world to the first. Lee Kuan Yew didn't just lead Singapore, he built it, he made it. Once the Gibraltar of the East, Singapore is again a symbol of to the world of enterprise, confidence and initiative, of self-reliance and success. Singapore's success is founded on the ideas, the drive and the judgment of Lee Kuan Yew, on the talents of the Singaporean people that he unleashed, and on a legacy of law and language that he respected and built on. Lee Kuan Yew insisted that all Singaporeans learn English. He maintained the legal system built on common law, and even preserved the statue of Raffles as a sign of the regard that he expected Singapore to have for this heritage. Back in 1965, Australia was the very first country to recognise Singapore's independence. Sir Robert Menzies, our Prime Minister at the time, deeply respected Lee Kuan Yew, while Lee Kuan Yew said that Menzies was the Australian leader who had most impressed him. The esteem that Lee and Menzies had for each other was a strong foundation for the friendship between our nations that has grown and grown ever since. As we've heard, Singapore is Australia's largest trade and investment partner in ASEAN and our 5th largest trading partner overall. We already have a robust free trade agreement. It was just the 2nd that Australia negotiated after closer economic relations with New Zealand. There are now 3,500 businesses with Australian links operating in Singapore, spanning infrastructure, IT, education, financial services and logistics. We have invested many tens of billions of dollars in each other, a sure sign of our mutual trust and respect. Over the past half-century, more than 130,000 Singaporeans have been educated at Australian universities under the Colombo Plan and beyond. The new Colombo Plan, started last year, has already seen nearly 500 Australian students study in Singapore. We are finally returning the compliment that Singapore has paid to us and hope to learn as much in your country as you have in ours. Each year, over 350,000 Australians now travel to Singapore for business or pleasure, and a similar number of Singaporeans come to Australia. Almost since Singapore's independence, we've been military partners in the 5 power defence arrangements, along with the United Kingdom, New Zealand and Malaysia. Over the past decade, we've both contributed to military operations in Afghanistan, and we're now working together in the skies over Iraq. For many years, the Singapore Armed Forces have trained in Queensland, and a Singapore Air Force squadron has been stationed in Western Australia. The comprehensive strategic partnership signed this morning with Prime Minister Lee will produce a whole new level of intimacy over the next decade. We're becoming family, not just friends. In some ways, Australia and Singapore could hardly be more different. Australia is a country with its own continent, sparsely settled, mostly by European people, with a successful resources economy. Singapore is a tiny but teeming island whose people are mostly of Chinese descent, with a dynamic services economy. But in other ways, we have much in common. The English language, the rule of law, a high and rising standard of living, and support for the US-backed global order, which has made the world's comparative freedom and prosperity possible. Singapore seeks opportunities to expand beyond its domestic market. Australia seeks investment, especially in our great north. That's why we have so much to offer each other. We are natural partners. We could hardly be more complementary. My hope is that Australia's relationship with Singapore will swiftly grow as easy, close and familiar as it has long been with New Zealand. The comprehensive strategic partnership that Australia and Singapore have concluded today also moves us towards the closer economic relations that Australia and New Zealand have enjoyed for 30 years. Over time, I hope that Singaporeans will regard Australia, especially the North, as a frontier of opportunity, and that Australians will regard Singapore, as much as London, as a place to gain the world's best professional experience. Soon, I hope that employment and residency rights for Australians and Singaporeans in each other's country will resemble those of New Zealanders and Australians. This will make both our countries even more successful and secure. In any event, our partnership is deepening as our region is rising. Over the past few decades, the Asia-Pacific region has achieved an economic transformation unparalleled in human history. Japan has arisen from the ashes of defeat to become one of the world's most prosperous democracies. Korea has moved from the third world to the first in less than half a century. In an epic improvement, China has emerged from war and internal turmoil to shift hundreds of millions of people from the third world to the middle class. This is the greatest, fastest change for the better of all time. And so much of our region's prosperity has been built on Australian coal, iron ore and gas. Now and far into the future, we can offer the countries of our region the food, energy and resource security they seek. For Australia, the tyranny of distance has given way to the advantage of proximity. Our Asia-Pacific region now accounts for over half the global population, more than 1/3 of world gross domestic product and about 1/3 of world exports. Still, continued prosperity depends on continued security. In our own region, there has been some tension over the disputed islands and reefs of the East China and South China Seas. Australia does not take sides on competing territorial claims. We deplore unilateral moves to change the status quo and insist that disputes should be settled peacefully in accordance with international law. Like all trading nations, Australia upholds freedom of navigation on the seas and in the air. Land reclamation on a massive scale not only unsettles the mutual respect upon which our prosperity depends, but threatens one of the world's most complex and beautiful reef systems. These actions have strained some of the relationships that China has otherwise worked hard to cultivate. On the other hand, China's readiness to work with other countries on the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank has meant the emergence of a new Chinese-led international institution with better governance. As a result, Australia will join Singapore and more than 50 other countries in joining this bank at a signing ceremony in Beijing later today. And there is a lesson here. There is a lesson here. The countries of the Asia-Pacific have too much to gain from cooperation and too much to lose from confrontation. Participation in ASEAN and then in the East Asia Summit has built the habits of cooperation needed to manage regional issues. all our regional architecture, including APEC, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting, is designed to defuse regional tensions. History is a bad master, but a good teacher. And the hard-earned lesson of our history is that we will all advance together, or none of us will advance at all. Now, it is harder to be optimistic about Eastern Europe, where Russia is continuing to bully its smaller neighbours whenever they look to Western Europe rather than their former Soviet overlord. Still, Western sanctions are hurting, and the reaction to Russian aggression does seem to have produced a more united and more determined Ukraine. It's harder still to be optimistic about the Middle East, where hostility to Israel, long-standing tensions between Iran and its neighbours, sectarian splits within Islam, and a pervasive sense of grievance have helped to create the monster of ISIL or Daesh. I refuse to call this death cult Islamic State, because to do so insults the Muslims it is killing every day and concedes legitimacy to a movement at war with the world. Still, Daesh is consolidating its hold over an area as large as Italy, with about 8 million people. Its affiliates control large swathes of Libya and Nigeria and are active in the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. It is seeking to establish a far province in Southeast Asia. It is the deadly enemy of all governments and of all people, even those it has enslaved. It cannot be contained. It has to be defeated. This weekend's attacks in France, Tunisia, and Kuwait are simply its latest atrocities. In the past year, Daesh and its imitators have carried out terrorist attacks in Belgium, France, Canada, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, Nigeria, Denmark, and the United States, as well as Australia, in Melbourne and in my hometown of Sydney. I regret to say that we can expect more and worse atrocities as long as even a small minority of people are susceptible to its message. As the declaration of a caliphate shows, it is coming for everyone on the basis of a twisted interpretation of the Quran. Submit or die. Daesh is using an online world without borders to brainwash our young people and to accustom them to kill for their cause. More than 20,000 people from over 80 countries have gone to Syria and Iraq to join Daesh. Up to 300 Indonesians and 90 Malaysians are currently thought to be fighting for Daesh in the Middle East. Thais, Filipinos, Cambodians and even Singaporeans have also joined, although in much smaller numbers. And I regret to say that at least 120 Australians are currently fighting in Syria and Iraq, with about 160 at home recruiting for them and funding them. Our domestic security agency is currently investigating several thousand persons of concern and has over 400 high-priority cases. We have more foreign fighters, more terrorist supporters, and more terrorist sympathisers than ever before. A decade or so back, more than 300 Southeast Asians had trained with terrorist groups in Afghanistan or Pakistan. On their return, more than 80 were arrested or killed in counter-terrorism operations. Of the Jamia Islamiyah terrorists directly involved in the 2002 Bali bombings, which killed 202 people, including 88 Australians, 11 out of 17 had trained with terrorist groups in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Of the 25 Australians who had returned home after training with terrorists, 19 were subsequently involved in terrorist plotting, and 8 were convicted of terrorism offences. So this is a daunting precedent, given the many hundreds from our region already fighting in the Middle East right now. Now, living in pluralist democracies under the rule of law, where killing in the name of God is almost unimaginable, it's hard even to begin to appreciate the motives and methods of an apocalyptic death cult. Daesh will seek to expand until it's overthrown. That's what the logic of the caliphate demands. So there are no good options here, but the worst is simply hoping for the best, waiting for something to turn up, or expecting someone else to do the heavy lifting. The difference between the last American involvement in the Middle East and any stronger one now would be that this is in support of the legitimate government of Iraq. The difference between this outbreak of doomsday fundamentalism and the last lesser one is that Daesh has united almost every Muslim authority against it. This is not a fight that can be won quickly or easily, but it can't be avoided. Some might question whether we're at war with them, but they're certain that they're at war with us. It's a military and a security struggle, but it's also a struggle inside hearts, minds, and souls. And yesterday, I visited one of Singapore's de-radicalisation programs that involves family members, mentoring relationships, and religious engagement to wean people from the idea that serving God means killing infidels, so we can succeed when we turn our minds to it. The world should be grateful for Singapore's solidarity and readiness to be part of the international coalition against Daesh in the Middle East. Singapore, along with Australia, has been willing to shoulder its responsibilities to uphold the freedom and security of the wider world. Now, one of the Australian servicemen who arrived in Singapore just a few weeks before its fall was John Gorton. In late January 1942, he crash-landed after a dogfight with a Japanese aircraft. As he was being evacuated, his ship was torpedoed. Gorton would return to Singapore 26 years later, this time as the Prime Minister of Australia. He warned, "History shows that those who neglect security, those who neglect defence, do so ultimately at their own peril." And as our foremost historian, Geoffrey Blainey, has observed, a nation can only be neutral with the consent of its potential enemies. Australia and Singapore are too engaged with the world to avoid its difficulties. We are too small to change the world on our own, but we should never doubt the difference we can make. We need the world, but the world needs us, and we'll be the better for our work together. Thank you so much. It is an honour and a privilege to deliver this lecture, and I am exceedingly grateful for the opportunity to do so.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to begin by praising Australia. I'm Tommy Koh, and I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also for the University of Singapore. I would like to begin by praising Australia. Prime Minister, Australia has always played a positive and constructive role in the affairs of the region. I recall, for example, that in 1997, during the Asian financial crisis, there were only two countries, Australia and Japan, that went to the assistance of all the affected countries. I also recall that in 2004, during the Indian Ocean tsunami, Australia played a major role in helping the affected countries. And now my question. Earlier today, you signed an agreement with Prime Minister Lee to elevate our already excellent bilateral relation to a higher level, to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Can you explain to us what are the implications of this relationship and what new benefits and opportunities it will bring to our countries and our peoples?
Well, thank you so much for the question, and thank you for the chance to elucidate on some of the improvements and benefits that this comprehensive strategic partnership will bring. And yes, as you rightly say, it's building on what is already a very strong friendship, and it's building on what is already a very, very strong Australian engagement with our region and the wider world. We are a people who naturally like to roll our sleeves up and help when there's trouble. We are a people who like to get on with the job. We don't much blow our own trumpets. We don't take ourselves too seriously, but we're good at what we do and we get on with things. And that's what Prime Minister Lee and I, assisted by Ministers Shanmugam and Rob, are determined to do, to get on with things and within 12 months advance a long way down the road to the comprehensive strategic partnership that we signed today. The two areas that we most immediately want to advance are the ability of our peoples to live and work in each other's country. This is very important because Australians have a lot to contribute to Singapore, now one of the world's very greatest business and financial centres. Singaporeans have much to contribute to our country as well, both as students, as residents, and as visitors. So we really want to crack on with ensuring that it's easier for each other to live and work in each other's country. It's easier to recognise each other's qualifications, particularly given the extraordinarily high standards of qualifications in both of our countries. The other thing that's so important is an ever deeper defence and security partnership, because not only do we face similar challenges, but we have a very, very similar outlook on the world. While there are superficial differences between Australia and Singapore, there are fundamental communities of interest and values upon which we build. And I can't see Singapore changing, I can't see Australia changing when it comes to this fundamental commitment to freedom under the law, this fundamental commitment to a rules-based international order, a fundamental commitment to the rights of all to live unmolested by others on the basis of might is right. And of course, it will be so much easier for the Singaporean armed forces to maintain their already high levels of expertise and professionalism if they are able to do more work, spend more time in Australia. It will help us to maintain our levels of expertise and professionalism if we are able to work more regularly with the outstanding armed forces of Singapore, and that's exactly what we intend to do. We have a very strong relationship with the United States. We've got strong traditional relationships in defence and security with the United Kingdom, and we wish to elevate our relationship with Singapore to those sorts of levels in the years to come.
Can I take the next question, please?
Thank you. Prime Minister, my name is Victor Savage from the National University of Singapore. My question deals with the South China Sea issue. What exactly is the Australian position with regards to the territorial claims that China is making of the South China Sea? And how do you see the escalation of tensions between China and the US, and how will it affect the peace and security of ASEAN countries?
Well, this is a very good question, and it's obviously one which has exercised the minds of many people in recent times. Australia's position on the various claims is identical with that of Singapore. We take no sides between the claimants, but we think that the claimants should resolve their disputes peacefully and in accordance with international law, and we deplore unilateral actions to alter the situation on the ground. Likewise, we uphold freedom of navigation of the sea and in the air. So we have a very clear position. We support the Code of Conduct discussions, and we hope that they can come to a satisfactory and swift conclusion. Is it causing tensions? Obviously it is. Should we fixate on this? No, we should not, because this is far from the only issue between the various countries and powers of our region. And I think it always helps to advance if you focus on the things where progress is possible rather than focus on the things where progress is very difficult at all. And so rather than dwell on tit-for-tat actions in the South China Sea, rather than dwell on unilateral alterations to the situation on the ground, I'd rather focus on the good things that are happening in our region, and obviously one of the very best of them is the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank going forward right now, including Australia, Singapore, involving some 50 countries, including many like-minded Western countries. So this is a sign of the world's willingness, our willingness to say to China, we respect your success, we admire your success, we want to work with you, we accept that there are legitimate positions of leadership to which you should quite rightly and properly aspire, and we're happy to work with you as long as it's in accordance with the kind of principles on which international institutions have typically operated. And so thanks to the willingness of countries like Singapore and Australia to work constructively with China, China is now leading, or will shortly be leading, a new and important international institution. And there's got to be a lesson here in this. There's got to be a lesson here in this. If you work with countries, a position of leadership is yours to be had. If you work against countries, however justified you might think you are, that kind of respect and leadership is far less likely to be achieved.
Perhaps we come across to this side of the hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honorable Prime Minister, sir, I had the honor of being seated with you at the same table this morning at the breakfast session. You spoke very well on Australia's engagement with Asia, particularly with Singapore, and also on how Singapore and Australia can work together to strengthen regional links and enhance our shared prosperity. I mentioned that I will ask you a simple question, which I'm going to do now. Sir, we have often read and heard about your government's taking steps to restructure your country's tax regime, foreign property ownership, carbon emission tax, which you have done, and immigration policies such as permanent residency applications, employment permits, and entry visa requirements. As you know, these are matters which are very important to foreign companies when they consider investing in Australia. So to the extent that you have to consider your domestic political, social, and economic agendas, in considering that Australians are a very mature, outspoken, and vocal people, and also that you have a very strong opposition in Parliament, quite unlike here in Singapore, how can and will your government make policy changes in these issues that will make it easier and also friendlier for Asians, particularly Singaporeans, to invest in and engage more deeply with Australia? One simple example is that Singaporeans still need a visa to visit Australia. Thank you, sir.
Perhaps you could just, for the benefit of the audience and the Prime Minister, just identify yourself.
Oh, I'm Chua Yong Hai. I'm used to be in the government administrative service, now a businessman with very deep connection to Australia.
Thank you very much, Yong Hai.
Now, just on the question of visas, Andrew Robb, who's in the front row of the audience next to Prime Minister Lee, is our Minister for Trade and Investment and also the Minister for Tourism. And he might correct me if I'm wrong, but I am pretty confident that Singaporeans can get visas on arrival. That's my confidence. And certainly one of the things that we'll be looking at as part of our development of the comprehensive strategic partnership, the closer economic relations, is further enhancing the movement of our peoples between our two countries. So that's an easy one to say we're in absolute agreement and we will make a good situation even better in the months and years ahead. On the subject of economic reform, in stable democracies, particularly stable democracies that have a robust, at times even a, well, I was going to say rancorous discourse, but no. Harsh words are never said in Australia between political opponents, and we accept each other's goodwill and commitment to a better world. But notwithstanding that, sometimes it is difficult to get things through our parliament, but this just means that we in government have to lift our game. We can never let parliamentary difficulties act as an excuse for not getting on with the beneficial changes that we think our country needs. You rightly enumerate a list of the changes that we have put in place over the last 18 months or so: the abolition of the carbon tax, the abolition of the mining tax, substantial savings in government expenditure so that we can continue to responsibly lower taxes. We've got a continued reform agenda to bring the workplace relations pendulum back to the sensible centre, to work as constructively as we can with the states to try to ensure that taxes are lower and simpler and fairer, to work as constructively as we can with the states to try to make the operation of government in our federation more effective and more efficient, and fundamentally to deliver better schools and better hospitals, which is what the people so want. But I wouldn't underestimate just how much success has already been achieved, and we've just finished a fortnight of Parliament in Australia, and it's probably been the most productive fortnight of this term of Parliament so far in terms of long-lasting reforms to our pension system, long-lasting reforms to some elements of our taxation system, tidying up some of the aspects of our social security system which had been overtaken by events. So while reform is never easy, reform is necessary, and certainly I think the government has demonstrated over the last 18 months or so, and particularly in the last few weeks, that reform is very much possible.
Perhaps we come across to this side of the hall. Yes.
UDPM. My name is Termsak from the ASEAN Study Center of the ISEAS. Prime Minister, you mentioned Australia is not big and not trying to change the world, but Australia is part of the founding participating countries of the East Asia Summit, and you have attended 2 East Asia Summit in Brunei and Myanmar, and the 10th anniversary coming up this year in Malaysia. Can you share with us your personal assessment of the EAS? Do you entertain any idea to make this group of potentially the most influential leaders in the world to do something together to change the world, or at least to address some of the common security challenge that you have mentioned? Thank you, sir.
Well, one of the reasons why I am so fundamentally optimistic about our region is because thanks to the good work of a couple of generations of regional leaders now, we have in place a regional architecture which keeps people talking. We come together regularly to talk, and as long as you're talking, you're not fighting. Yes, you might be arguing, but as long as you're arguing with words, you're not arguing with things that can do people more harm. So I think that the regional architecture that has been established over ASEAN and then very much with ASEAN leadership in our region has enormous, I think it's very prospective, and I think that the leaders of a generation ago who were responsible for the foundation of ASEAN and the subsequent leaders who established the East Asia Summit, who have established the other groupings of which ASEAN is the core, have done the entire world an enormous service. I really do think that the entire world has been done an enormous service. We have 2 great countries, very active and successful in our part of the world, in addition to Australia, Singapore, Indonesia, etc. We obviously have the United States and China. I am sure that their relationship will be much more constructive and ultimately much more helpful to the wider world, precisely because of the ASEAN-based regional architecture that has been established to keep them talking, to keep them together.
It will be okay if we take these 2 more questions.
Yeah, sure.
Come, please.
Good evening to all, and privileged to talk to the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, and the presence of Prime Minister Lee too. My name is Percy Jayapal from Engineers Australia Singapore chapter. And my main thrust of the question is that, yes, you have now established with Prime Minister Lee mutual recognition as well as working complementary between Singapore and Australia. But the reality is that they need to have a dismantling of a lot of barriers, especially when you have a lot of experience and well-qualified engineers from Australia. But whether it's in ASEAN countries or in Singapore, they have to go through certain processes of recognition. Whereas Commonwealth-wise, all the qualifications are very much equal. So will there be a high-level committee to help to dismantle so that there is a seamless process of engineers being able to be recognized and to mutually work in each other's countries? Thank you, sir.
Well, you raise a very practical question, and I'll try to give you a very simple response. In principle, professional qualifications from comparable countries should be mutually recognised. That's the principle. Professional qualifications from comparable countries should be mutually recognised. I know that there are job protection rackets in all countries which conspire against that simple principle. I was a health minister in Australia, and I know how even as high-minded and benevolent a group as the medical profession can sometimes engage in job protection rackets, and others can do likewise. The challenge for government is to firmly, politely but firmly, knock down these barriers in the interests of prosperity.
I think I'll just allow one last question from Simon. He's been waiting for some time. Prime Minister is to leave at 5, so I'll just take one last question.
Thank you, DPM. I'll try to be brief. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for your remarks. As you mentioned earlier today in another signing ceremony, Australia was among the first countries to sign the Articles of Association of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The United States had actively encouraged many of its allies not to be part of the founding members group, and many of its allies, Australia, Singapore, Britain, Korea and others, nevertheless decided to go through with that, something that perhaps 10 years ago would have been unthinkable to not disregard, but to go against America's wishes in this way. So 2 questions. First, do you think it was a mistake by the United States to oppose the AIIB as it did? And second, what do you think the fact that so many of its allies were willing to sign on says about the changing status of China and the United States in the region?
Perhaps for the Prime Minister's benefit, you may want to just identify yourself.
I'm sorry, Simon Chesterman. I teach law at the National University of Singapore, but as you might guess from the accent, originally from Melbourne.
Yes, they're very cheeky, these Melburnians. Well, I don't see any of Australia's relationships in an either-or context. I like to see all of our relationships in an and context, so a both-and context. So I think it's possible for Australia to have a family relationship with New Zealand and with Singapore. I think it's possible for Australia to have a very strong relationship with the United States without in any way preventing us from having a strong and growing relationship with China. Now, I accept that America was a little ambivalent, to put it mildly, about the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. We looked long and hard at the proposal that there be a Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and we looked long and hard at the invitation to join. And we decided that, as always, the best way to proceed was on the basis of principle. And what we've always done is been ready to join international organisations which had good and transparent governance arrangements and which were not controlled by any one country. And on that basis, we were happy to be part of the World Bank and the IMF. On that basis, we were happy to be part of the Asia Development Bank, and provided we could get those sorts of governance and transparency arrangements, we thought, why shouldn't we be prepared to be part of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank? If you're not able to proceed on the basis of principle, you're proceeding on the basis of favouritism. And yes, we will always have our friends, but let's have friends on the basis of defensible principles. And so that's why we've made the decision that we have. Certainly we talked long and hard with the Chinese. We talked long and hard with like-minded countries that were similarly considering what to do with this bank. And in the end, I think a lot of conversations by a lot of good people with the Chinese have produced a much better outcome, an outcome that all of us can be proud of, including China, because it will provide a vehicle that will quite properly acknowledge China's rightful leadership in so many areas while at the same time preserving the rights of others. So I think this has been a good outcome, and my hope is that once it becomes more and more obvious that this bank is a very valuable addition to the world's global institutional architecture, that countries like America might reconsider and might decide to come in. Certainly as far as I'm concerned, and I suspect as far as many other countries are concerned, they would be welcome to come in.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister, for sharing with us your thoughts on our common challenges, strengthening security in the region, and for so generously answering so clearly and directly the many questions that were posed to you from the floor. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and thank you, DPM. Now, before Prime Minister Abbott leaves, we would like the Prime Minister to have a more lasting memory of today's lecture and discussions. And to this end, Professor Wang Gungwu, the Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, will present mementos to Prime Minister Abbott from our institute. First is the selection of books published by the Institute, and second is a special creation by Mr. Iskandar Jalil, Singapore's foremost artist in ceramics and pottery. And the piece, which will now be unveiled by Professor Wang, is entitled Inspiration During Ramadan. Thank you, Professor Wang, and thank you once again, DPM, sir. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the 35th Singapore lecture. May I request everyone to remain in your seats while Prime Minister Abbott, PM Lee, and their respective entourages leave the ballroom. Thank you.